Hi, this is a learning theorist presentation on Paulo Freire, prepared by Michelle Horton and Ajar Dushimbia. We will start by sharing a brief information on Paulo Freire's life, concepts. We will also review the historical context and Freire's ontology, epistemology, methodology through the interactive game. We will present an in-depth analysis of Freire's two books, Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Education for Critical Consciousness. Finally, we will discuss Freire's influence on current and past teaching and learning practices. Paulo Freire came of age in the turbulent years of transition from authoritarian conservative government to authoritarian populist government in Latin America. Freire was born into a middle-class family on September 19, 1921. The experiences of his family during the Great Depression, which started in 1929, set the tone for his later concern for the poor and influenced his perspective on education. In his work, Freire was influenced by Christianism in the sense that theory needs to be followed by praxis, as well as ideas of Hegel and Marx. Circles of culture is a concept central in Freire's work. Freire used circles of culture in which the students were encouraged to learn through dialogue with the educators. Paulo Freire's inclination for adult education was rooted in his background. He grew up in poverty and was imprisoned for 7 years. This historical reality has inspired him to create a new pedagogy based on humanization and liberation. His goal was to develop better citizens, and he believed that knowledge is constructed. For this presentation, we will provide analysis of two of his works, Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Education for Critical Consciousness. We wanted to share this quote from Pedagogy of the Oppressed because it fully captures Freire's ideas on liberation. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire refers to Hegel when discussing the dialectic of slave. Slave values their life more than freedom and agrees to be submissive. In order to serve efficiently, the slave becomes a humanized producer of art, sciences, and practices. Freire also discusses how system of inequality is reproduced. The system of inequality is reproduced through a fight between who dominates and who is dominated. Freire provides a definition of a master whose freedom is more valuable than his life. Oppressors use education to infuse ideas that accommodate them. Oppressors need to oppress to keep the power. Early education's purpose in the original sense, according to Freire, is to make them submissive. Teachers' role is to talk and pour knowledge because students are seen as empty vessels. Students' role is being recipients that need to be filled. Oppressors in education rely on memorization and repetition, and they are convinced they know everything. In the book, Freire also provides characteristics of the oppressed: losing hope, low self-esteem, fatalism, and incapacity correspond to students. Fatalism: nothing is going to change. Why bother going to school? This is how oppressed think. Students become submissive and domesticated. This is what Freire proposes. Teachers, students, and their families need to have equal roles. This book has been an inspiration for many disciplines, but also has been forbidden in places such as Arizona. We would like your ideas as to why do you think the book was forbidden. Please feel free to share your ideas in the comments. The second book that we analyzed for this presentation is Education for Critical Consciousness. This book captures the essence of Freire's insights. This is not about education per se, but about revolution and transformation into more enlightened and empowering democratic perspectives and civic structures, using a participatory, context-aware, and culturally self-critical consciousness that allows everyone involved equal footing and inherent value. The book is composed of two essays, Education as the Practice of Freedom and Extension or Communication. The two essays, written in 164 pages, are complementary in that they both draw on dialogue and communication, as well as a sense of autonomy over one's social and political consciousness as central tenets in the shift from being passive objects to engaged subjects. The first essay presents the development of a critical consciousness and the empowerment of people as cultural actors as the basis for social change, within which literacy becomes an important tool. The second explores oppressive tendencies in non-formal educational settings, particularly as they pertain to extension work, and the necessary steps which must be taken to create a space of liberation and social engagement for all. Now, in the next several slides, we will highlight some of the important notions in the Education as the Practice of Freedom essay. Freire's belief in people's potential and purpose as agents of change is strongly felt. Empowering people to seize themselves as cultural actors is the basis of his approach, and literacy is presented as a tool with which to transform the world. However, essential to this process is critical consciousness. The ability of ordinary people to shape their reality is often crushed by social forces and is largely determined by their historical context. In the case of Brazil, the colonial experience and slavery have given people little opportunity to experience democracy. Freire also refers to the manipulative role of advertising, a point that is all too relevant today. Having a critical outlook on the world enables people to move from a reactionary to a progressive position where they can shape their reality. Freire describes the development of a critical consciousness as a five-part process, beginning with people moving from a semi-transitive state where they are preoccupied with survival to a transitivity of consciousness. This openness to reflecting on themselves, their role and responsibilities, enables people to have dialogue with others and with the world. Initially, people find themselves in a state of naive transitivity, characterized by an oversimplification of problems, but hopefully graduate to a state of critical transitivity with a more in-depth analysis of problems and an increase in agency. However, this progression is not automatic, and failure to move along this continuum results in a fanaticized consciousness, a reactionary state wrought by sectarianism. Critical consciousness is the awakening of critical awareness resulting from educational efforts and favorable historical conditions. Freire illustrates the importance of context at length with a historical analysis of Brazil, where a democratic model was imposed, not cultivated from within. Yet, during times of historical transition, people's capacity to develop a critical consciousness and affect change is heightened. From a transformative learning perspective, this is the case worldwide today as we negotiate a paradigm shift from a modernist to a post. The role of the educator in enabling people to critically analyze the world and see themselves as able to transform it is pivotal. According to Freire, in order for people to develop critical consciousness, they must first see themselves as cultural actors. Initially, Freire undertook this democratization of culture in culture circles, where people discussed various context-relevant situations, seeking clarification and action stemming from their analysis. While facilitated by a coordinator, these dialogues are a mutual learning process. Through these culture circles, people gain an anthropological understanding of culture and come to see themselves as subjects, not objects, within the process of culture formation. Freire's literacy method evolved out of these culture circles, presenting literacy as an important tool to effect social change. In the last section of the essay, the basic components of Freire's literacy methods are presented with particular reference to his experience teaching in Brazil prior to the 1964 military coup. While the elaboration of the dialogical method is further elaborated in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the process leading to cultural emancipation is emphasized in Education as a Practice of Freedom, including an appendix with the visual representation of existential situations used in cultural circles to help participants to see themselves as creators of culture. In Freire's words, one must make it possible for them to achieve critical consciousness so that they can teach themselves to read and to write. However, in a footnote, Freire mentions that his methods were considered subversive given that he related literacy to critical consciousness and approached education as liberation and not domestication. Freire's militant democracy led to his exile after the 1964 military coup. In his 1968 essay, Extension or Communication, Freire captures the idea, which to date is central in the lingua franca of anti-colonial discourse, that while all development is modernization, not all modernization is development. The piece of challenges the role of the extension worker and explores alternative liberatory methods which allow for a shift from the static, unengaged banking approach that extension traditionally implies and applies within an educational context. Following an in-depth exploration of the term extension from a linguistic, critical, philosophical, and social perspective, he concludes that the practice of extension as a tool for education in agrarian reform is paradoxical and does not allow space to engage in critical consciousness, particularly as the role of the extension worker is reduced to the mere act of extending his or her knowledge. It results in a static relationship between the extension worker and the peasant and further perpetuates the notion that the learner is an object as opposed to an engaged subject capable of critically viewing the world and making decisions. Throughout the essay, as in his other works, Freire makes the plea to recognize education as a gnosiological condition, meaning to recognize the origin, nature, and validity of knowledge. Specifically, viewing education as one which encompasses characteristics such as love for dialogue, critical, participatory, and has capacity to unite the educator and students as subjects in the process of knowing. He argues that when these criteria are not met, education diminishes into verbalism and is no longer inviting to transcend to a level of critical engagement. Education thus becomes inconsequential. Freire argues that despite authenticity in different phases and levels of knowledge, none must be negated as valuable to the worldviews of those who embrace that particular knowledge. Furthermore, it is the role of the extension worker to assist in overcoming the magic perception of reality, while at the same time achieving technical training. Central to the essay is the idea that the approach taken by extension workers results in cultural invasion as a sole solution to liberation. He elucidates this conclusion through three phases. There lies an assumption that knowledge is being deposited into an empty consciousness, also known as banking education. There is an underestimation of their power of reflection, of their ability to take on the true role of seekers of knowledge. Hence the tendency to transform them into objects of the knowledge imposed on them. The lack of faith in people results in the third phase, which is the assertion that ignorance is absolute. This assumption spirals back into the of the banking model of education and denies any sense of agency and free will that liberatory education seeks to achieve. The varying dimensions of cultural invasion fall under the umbrella of hegemony, resulting in the domestication and manipulation of the recipients. Reminding the reader that extension does not imply education, Freire highlights that education is communication and dialogue, and it is the role of educator to move the dialogue forward through problem posing and, most importantly, critical dialogue. Reciprocity in communication creates space for engaged subjects where knowledge is propagated, and the dialectic relations with reality enable conditions with continuous liberation and challenge to oppressed situations. There is an explicit expression that liberation is a collective engagement as critical consciousness takes place in social structures, and thus education can never be neutral. Freire's pedagogical approach has been taken up well beyond Brazil or Latin America. His method and theories were introduced into the world as a revolution of adult learning. His impact on literacy training, in particular, has stood the test of time, and is reflected in a multitude of initiatives, programs, and documents. Paulo Freire is considered the originator of the theoretical model of critical pedagogy that has influenced the educational training of teachers, particularly in the United States, but also in several other countries. His work reflects the quintessential nature of comparative and international education. Freire's critique of banking education, the idea of education for freedom, the fact that his theoretical framework can be used to study the relations between class, race, ethnicity, gender, and the state in education, and its role in illuminating the intricate relationship between politics and education through the paradigm of popular education. All of these have meant that Freire's message has made a deep and lasting impact on educational models. The movement for popular education in Latin America, Africa, and Asia owes a great deal of its theoretical foundations, methodology, and praxis to the work of Paulo Freire and the pedagogies of liberation. After the crisis of neoliberalism, these models of popular education have acquired renewed energy in the context of counteracting the crisis of capitalism, and are being used by social movements in new and original ways. In the following several slides, we present an overview of the generative themes that you can read through. Please copy and paste the link in a new tab to learn more about Paulo Freire through the interactive game. Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire's notion of constructivist pedagogy and his interdisciplinary approach have impacted on many disciplines and practices across the world. While his theories have crossed the borders of disciplines and sciences, his reflections have deepened the theme that he pursued his whole life: education as the practice of freedom. His theories spilled over into different fields of knowledge, from education to health, from pedagogy to politics, from sociology to social work. There is no question that Paulo Freire's border-crossing perspective in the 1960s resulted in a transdisciplinary approach that has gained even more recognition in the new century. Here's the list of the materials that we used in preparation for this presentation. Thank you for watching this presentation. We look forward to reading your questions and comments. Thank you.